So our next speaker is Salvador Chinchilla. He's also a student of the Institute of Philosophy at the University of Antioquia. So Salvador, please.
Yes, thank you. I'll just share my screen. Give me 1 second. Can you? Is it
perfect?
Does it look fine? All right. Okay. And there's, well, I don't have slides. The only thing I have is like the plainest handout ever. But there's also it's also in the chat in case you want to download it and sort of follow the talk at your own pace. But anyway. So Santiago has just spoken to you about indirect or indirected agency in response to a certain pessimistic view about mental agency. And what I would like to do now, and I'm largely sympathetic to that response, but what I would like to do now is to present to you with another different response to that same view, but one which is based around the idea of direct, or I say rather say basic mental agency. And sort of as a secondary objective, I'd like to do that by just employing some very rudimentary tools that are quite familiar in action theory, and specifically within the causal theory of action. So, but before stating my thesis more explicitly, let me just restate this view that I'm opposing. I call this the Strauss-Mealy view, and rather than skepticism, I think that it is a form of pessimism about the scope of mental agency. Roughly, it states that the scope of mental agency is more limited than is usually thought, because the occurrence or coming about of mental content is somehow uncontrolled and thus non-agentive. One can only set the stage for such content to appear. So if mental content is construed broadly as anything a mental state might be about, then this view concerns states such as memory or imagination, which involve the production or the coming about of content for the thinking subject. And unlike full-blown skepticism, this view does not want to deny that there's any difference at all between, say, intentional and non-intentional memory or imagination. But what it says is that when one intentionally remembers, all one really does, that is, one's intentional contribution, is limited to, as I put it here, setting the stage, say by focusing or setting one's mind to the task or using different strategies, and then allowing for some automatic processes to unfold. So this view was put forward originally by Strawson, and I think it is useful to lay out his argument in 3 steps. He first starts from a certain appearance of passivity that seems that, well, this is a phenomenological insight that's kind of flimsy, but also kind of intuitive. He says that there's a certain appearance of passivity that is intrinsically associated with the coming to mind of content. As Joel Proust puts it, most mental acts include, or at least we experience them as including, sequences that are receptive rather than active. Either the content pops into the mind, so to speak, or it does not. So say when I try to remember my mother's face, the image of her face seems to be, there's a sense in which the image of her face is something that just comes to me. And Strawson says, as a second step in the argument, that this is just what we could expect, or it is a reflection of a real, not just an appearance, but a real fact about our mental lives. Namely, that there's a sort of a real automaticity that is central to the production and coming about of content. There's a number of subpersonal automatic processes unfolding that are the ones that can be properly said to make the content happen. As Arango Munoz and Bermudez put it, the process of imaginative reconstruction, but we can say this about content production at large, seems to work spontaneously and subpersonally. All I can do at the personal level is conjuring the content and waiting for it to arrive. And now, since as automaticity is by definition a lack of control, whereas action is the presence or exertion of control over some given event or process, then we can infer from this real automaticity that there is a lack of action in the production and occurrence of content in states such as imagination or memory. So according to Strawson, remembering and imagining are not actions, properly said. This is a pretty straightforward argument, but there's a very important correction to be made to it, which was made by Alfred Mealy. He says, suppose that phi is an automatic process, such as content occurrence in this view. Then it is still possible for an agent to intentionally phi if by intentionally phiing you mean something like intentionally bringing about phi, and phiing is a non-basic action. So for instance, I cannot really try to sneeze because sneezing is an automatic process, but I can put pepper under my nose so as to induce myself to sneeze, as to make myself sneeze. And then the sneezing, though automatic, is part of and entailed by an intentional, non-basic action of bringing about the sneeze, which you could, if you wanted to, call intentionally sneezing. So I can intentionally sneeze, but only in a non-basic way, insofar as I can only do that through indirect means, say by setting up appropriate causal conditions for a sneeze to occur. So according to Mealy, all that Strawson's arguments really show is that remembering, imagining, and the like are not basic, where an action token phi is basic if and only if an agent does not perform some other action gamma as a means of doing phi. So according to many action theorists, there's this distinction between basic and non-basic action, where a basic action is just something that you can do without doing anything else in order to do it. The most uncontroversial examples seem to be bodily movements. It seems as though I can just raise my arm without doing anything else in order to raise it. By the way, I speak of action tokens rather than action types because many action types, such as arm raisings, allow for both basic and non-basic tokens. I can also raise my arm through some mechanical device or something. So I think putting together Strawson's argument with Mealy's correction gives us the definite statement of the Strawson-Mealy view, the Strawson-Mealy thesis, which says that since content involving events are automatic, then bringing about some mental content item is, if intentional, necessarily non-basic. What I would like to defend in what follows is a counterclaim to this, namely that it is plausible to believe that the bringing about of content often requires only basic mental agency, and so that remembering, imagining, etc. can be basic actions. So I'll give you two arguments in favor of this claim, which are sort of complementary. The first is that we appear to be able to sometimes bring about content items by just intending that they come to mind, where mere intending is also the only thing we do when we perform basic actions. I should have said this earlier, but in acting basically, I do not do anything else in order to perform the action or anything else other than just intending. That's sort of a mark of intentional action, that I intend that the relevant event happens. So this is a case of semantic memory. Suppose that I am asked to remember what the capital city of Colombia is. If A, this is not a familiar fact, then I may have to greatly focus on the task, run a number of images and facts about Colombia through my mind, and use other complex mnemonic strategies. Mealy calls this memory priming, but we could speak about content priming more generally. And this is the kind of case that Mealy seems to be thinking about, namely a case where we can identify a number of things that we do in order to remember. But this does not seem to be the only type of case, like intuitively. If the capital city of Colombia is a familiar fact to me, I may remember it fluidly in the sense that Goldwasser spells out. That is, it may just come to mind effortlessly as soon as I intend to remember it without any special priming being required. It seems like, in some cases at least, I can just remember by wanting to remember. And so the question that emerges from this is whether we can really say that in all instances of fluid remembering, imagining, etc., there is something we do beyond simply intending that the appropriate content comes. The intuitive answer to me seems to be no, but we can answer yes, but then for every action token B, which results in the coming about of content, one must be able to identify some other action token A that bears a teleological relation to B and is different from merely intending to be. Only then is the claim that B is basic falsified. This may seem intricate, but I'm just saying that if you claim that in order to remember or imagine, there must always be some other thing that we do and such that we remember or imagine by means of that other thing, that's a teleological relation, by means of or in order to relation, then you must be able to show for every such case what that other thing is, I think, ideally. And you should ideally have a really prepared set of things that we do in order to imagine or remember in most cases or in all cases. And only then could you really show that remembering or imagining are non-basic. I say this because Mealy and Strawson actually have a number of candidates for things that we supposedly do whenever we remember or imagine. So for instance, they have said that in order to remember, these are the action descriptions that I put in purple. In order to remember, we wait for the content to come, or we focus on its coming, that is Wayne Wu's option, or we conjure the content, we set the stage for it, we try to make it happen, or something like that. And those are supposed to be the more basic actions, which would make the remembering or imagining non-basic. But I think one way to show that these are not suitable or working candidates is to consider how one could, well, is to extrapolate them to the case of physical action, which in most of these instances you can, and to see how in the case of physical action, you cannot really falsify basicness claims, that is, claims that some actions are basic, through these action descriptions or through these purported actions. So consider that I tell you that I raised my arm. That's a physical action, and you may ask me how I did it in order to determine whether that's a basic or a non-basic action token. And if I tell you something like, well, I raised my arm by using my other arm to raise it, then it seems as though I have falsified the basicness claim for arm raising, in the sense that I have shown that it is not true that my arm raising is basic. But I may also tell you something like, well, I raised my arm by waiting for it to arise, to raise, sorry. And this seems like an odd response, and I don't think it falsifies a basicness claim. Simply because if it is indeed true that my arm raising was performed in a non-basic manner, then it seems as though I must have done something other than waiting in order for the arm to raise. And if that is to count as an intentional action of mine, that is, waiting does not seem to bear the appropriate teleological relation to other actions such that it could make them non-basic, because if they are to count as intentional non-basic actions of some agent, then that agent should be able to tell us what the other action he performed is other than waiting. And so I don't think that waiting fulfills what I would call a sufficiency condition, which can be spelled out by saying that if one could not perform some action B by only performing another action A, say if one could not raise one's arm by only waiting for it to raise, then one has not shown that B is non-basic with respect to A, because one still requires some other action that bears the appropriate teleological relation to B. So I think waiting and focusing are not so suitable candidates, though focusing might be a more interesting case, but I cannot really talk about that all that much. But then consider I tell you that I raise my arm by trying to make it raise. Well, this is also odd, but it is odd because of a different reason, namely that the action description is vague. I seem to be entitled to ask you in that case what exactly trying to make your arm raise consists in. And then you may tell me that you did a number of other things which may falsify the basicness claim, but you may also tell me something like, well, I tried to make my arm raise by intending to raise it. And in that case, the basicness claim would not be falsified. So I think the problem here is that descriptions such as trying to make something happen, for instance, trying to make my arm raise, do not fulfill what I would call a vagueness condition for the falsification of basicness claims. And this condition can be spelled out by saying that if the question of what doing some action A consists in is left open, then, for instance, if the question of what trying to make my arm raise consists in is left open, then another action B has not been shown to be non-basic with respect to A, because it may be the case that A just means intending to be. So when Millie and Strawson tell us things like that we conjure, or we set the stage for content, or we try to make it happen in order to remember or imagine, we seem to be entitled to ask them what conjuring or setting the stage exactly consist in. And if they have no better candidate other than just intending to remember or imagine, they will not have falsified the basicness claims for memory or imagination. So I do not have anything like a knockdown argument against the claim that in all instances of remembering or imagining, we do something else in order to do those things. But I can tell you that it seems implausible in light of these considerations and in light of the fact that the available candidates that have been often presented in the relevant literature do not seem to do the job all that well. At least those presented by Millie and Strawson. There may be others. So a second argument here, which I will go over more quickly, is that I think there are no real conceptual difficulties in admitting both that automatic subpersonal operations are central to the production of content and that such production is a basic action. So Wayne Wu has remarked, for instance, that the threat of automaticity, as present in content production and in memory and imagination, extends to bodily agency. Consider moving one's arm, he says, say to reach a glass. The specific movement that the agent is set to make is individuated by certain parameters, say the specific trajectory, speed, acceleration, and so forth. Yet in a similar sense, similar to the sense in which we speak of automaticity in mental life, the production of these features is merely automatic. What I think Wu is getting at is that there is a sort of non-agential surplus to every physical action, which does not falsify ascriptions of intentional agency. There's a set of features in every given action, or in almost every given action, such that the agent is not aware of them, or the agent is not aware of the mechanisms by which they are produced. And in that sense, they are non-agential features and mechanisms, but they do not imply that the action is not one of the agent or that it isn't intentional. In any arm racing, there are these kinds of features in trajectory, speed, acceleration, and these kinds of mechanisms in the number of physical causes that I may not be aware of, but they do not falsify ascriptions of intentional agency to me. And if this is so, even in the case of basic physical action, I think we ought to ask why it wouldn't be the case for basic mental action. So if automaticity plays such a big role in basic physical action, I think we are not entitled to say that a memory or imagination are non-basic or not actions just because they are in some sense, in some way, automatic. Put more clearly, the existence of automatic subpersonal mechanisms of content production does not entitle us to infer that content production is like sneezing, as Mealy says, any more than to infer that it's like, say, an arm raising. And I think more to the point, the contention that sneezing can only be performed in a non-basic manner doesn't seem primarily motivated by the automatic nature of a sneeze, this may be more controversial, but by our capacity to identify relevant actions that must always be performed in order to sneeze. I would ask you to consider, were you able to just sneeze at will, and were sneezing to still have its characteristic automatic unfolding? Would you or would you not say that you can perform sneezing in the way in which you can perform bodily actions? Regardless of your answer, I think that just by definition, sneezing would then be a basic action. Because if B is a basic action, then what must not be the case, what is really prohibited, is that there exists some relation M such that M holds between A and B, where A is a means to B and A and B are action tokens. And this last point is the important one, that non-basicness is a relation between action tokens. So the Strawson-Mealy thesis posits the existence of an automatic chain of causes N that operates in the production of any given mental content item. But precisely since these processes or events that make up N are subpersonal and uncontrolled, they are not actions. And since they are not actions, the relations that may hold between any given item of N and some action token A cannot make the action token non-basic. So in positing subpersonal mechanisms, you cannot really establish a non-basicness claim because those subpersonal mechanisms, insofar as they are not, as they do not figure in intentions at the personal level, are not actions, and therefore, since non-basicness is a relation between actions specifically, then you have not established a non-basicness claim. So I think we are able to, if you put these two arguments together, you can get a pretty good case for basic mental agency in the occurrence or production of content, which goes like this. Since A, first argument, there is good reason to believe that there are instances in which content is brought about in a basic manner, and B, there is no good reason to believe that mental content cannot be brought about in a basic manner, then C, I believe we are entitled to believe that bringing about mental content can be a basic action. Another way I like to put this is, since there are no conceptual difficulties due to the second argument in thinking that something can be automatic and basic and actional, then the burden of proof falls onto the one who's claiming that it is non-basic to show us what other actions are performed in order to do it. And I hope to have shown you somewhat persuasively, perhaps not completely, that the candidates that have been, that many of the candidates that have been proposed do not seem to do the job to falsify basicness claims. So just to finish, to wrap up, this case, I think, helps us retain an intuitive insight, at least it's intuitive to me, that we can just remember or imagine things sometimes, and that we have a privileged agentive relation to our minds. I'm not claiming that it is like the relation we have to our bodies, which is the paradigmatic basic engendering relation. But I think that it is privileged insofar as it allows for basic action. And I think it also implies that the Strawson-Millet view is not especially puzzling from an orthodox action theoretical perspective, which is the perspective that I wanted to take. So Strawson originally made a number of remarks that seem to conflict with our intuition that we can intentionally remember or imagine things. And I think, the puzzling appearance of these remarks was already quite heavily mitigated by Mealy, who showed that we could accommodate with these remarks and make them compatible with the intuition by just employing the notion of a non-basic action. But what I'm claiming is that you don't even really need that notion in order to accommodate Strawson's remarks within action theory and defend the intuition that we can intentionally remember or imagine. I don't know if that's clear, but I hope it is. So I've tried to show that by using only, as I've told you, very rudimentary, primitive tools that are generally available in action theory. And this basic non-basic distinction is not completely uncontroversial, and there are different ways to formulate it, but it is somewhat familiar, and most action theorists working under what is called the causal theory of action generally accept it. So that's what I wanted to say to you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Salvador. Could you stop sharing, please, your screen? Yeah, now you can see our clapping, because otherwise you won't see it. Thank you very much again for your presentation. And now we have time for questions. Does anybody want to start? If not, I have a first question. I mean, I really like your talk. The argumentation was clear. I like very much your second argument, because it seems to me that it's like a new move, but at the same time, it somehow puzzles me, because like your second argument was more like saying, like, if you go and see the subpersonal processes, they all seem to be automatic. And if you look to, for example, motor control, which is the control of the body, then you will see that all is working automatically, and there's nothing like the mark of the action there. And from that, you just said, okay, that may happen at this personal, but we still, it doesn't conflict with the idea that we still at the personal level feel that we are studying our actions, we are controlling our actions, we are having intentions and all and so forth. So my question would be, like, shouldn't we be happy with, I mean, with that, like saying, like, at this personal level, everything is automatic, and at the personal level, we seem to have control. I mean, the question is whether, like, because the first is, it seems to be like an empirical finding, and the second is just an intuitive seeming. It seems to us that we have control, but then the question would be, like, is that control really control? Are we really controlling? Or how can we, like, make sense of these two things going in a different way?
Yeah, so first, I'd like to say that I am aware that many of the work that's been done in this topic has tried to show, I think your work falls onto this under this label, has tried to show that subpersonal mechanisms do not imply a complete absence of control, right? And I think that's a valid argument. But what I would say is that even if they do, which I think they somewhat intuitively do, but perhaps not, it's still they are compatible with descriptions of intentional agency in actions that imply the presence of that kind of subpersonal control. So I think in motor processes we do have subpersonal control, at least in the sense that there are processes going on, mechanisms over which we may have some control, but which do not appear in our intentions at the personal level, and of which we may only be aware in a very vague level. And in that sense, even if we have some kind of control over those subpersonal mechanisms, I think it would be still valid to call them automatic in some sense of automaticity. What Wu and others like you have tried to show is that automaticity does not completely really imply any lack of any kind of control, but it does imply a lack of some kind of control. And what I'm saying is, well, even if it implies this some lack of control, nevertheless, it is not it does not falsify ascriptions of intentional agency either for physical or for mental action. But my claim would just be like, we have the same, we are entitled to believe that memory and imagination are not actions or not basic actions, just as much as we are entitled to believe that physical actions are not actions or not basic actions. And so that would be my argument. And that sort of can leave the question of whether automaticity implies a complete lack of control at the subpersonal level sort of untouched. So that would be my response.
Thank you. Eric.
Yeah, I also had a question about the second argument, and maybe the last thing you said kind of bears on it in a way that's not anticipated by my question, but let me put it like this. I mean, I'm wondering whether Mealy and Strawson could just accept most of what you say in that argument and then just say, right, so you were the one who was saying that the recall is an action. It's not an action, right? Just kind of parallel, Mealy might say, well, sneezing isn't really an action, it's just a reflex, right? So there is no action of recalling at all, right? So they could accept your argument and say, right, it's not a non-basic action, it's just not an action at all. The only action is the initial kind of setting up of things. So could they just go that way with the argument?
Yeah, I don't think I think they can, but I don't think that would be very effective, just because the point of the argument is you would not only have to admit that sneezing is not an action, but you would have to admit that arm raisings are not actions in the relevant sense, because there are also subpersonal automatic processes, also in the relevant sense going on there, which is what Wayne Wu tries to point out, namely that, as he says, the threat of automaticity extends to bodily agency, and not just to bodily agency in the sense in which it is present when you induce a sneeze, but also in the sense in which it is present when you raise your arm. So I think Wu is like really eloquent on this point, and my second argument just sort of rips him off a little bit. If you are committed to the idea that mental actions are not actions, you're also in some way committed to the idea that physical actions are not actions. And I don't think many people would be willing to accept that. Like, I don't think there's anything truly unintelligible about the idea that agency is an illusion or something like that. But I do think that that would be what is entailed if you say that automaticity, in the sense of the existence of subpersonal mechanisms beyond the agent's direct awareness, is non-actionable in some way. And there was another thing that I wanted to tell you, but I can't remember what it is. So anyway.
So I wonder if they could say, well, look, in the arm case, there's automaticity in the details, but the gross description of the action is not automatic.
Yeah, I think,
and that's the difference, right? So, so there's a non-automaticity in part of the arm reaching thing, but there isn't the same kind of non-automaticity in part of the recalling thing. So maybe they could lean on that apparent disanalogy.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting, and I think it touches on an issue that I deliberately sidelined, namely the difference which Santiago Agudelo treated between sort of future-directed control and concurrent control. I think, like, the way in which you could say that, you could make the argument that, say, remembering is more like sneezing than like arm raising, because in arm raising, even though there are subpersonal mechanisms, you have control throughout the process. And whereas in sneezing, you just set up causal conditions and then let the thing unfold. And I think that the argument could be made, but I think that would be a very weird picture of remembering. I think it can work sometimes, for instance, in these examples of semantic memory, where you just seem to, instantly recall something. But there are, and Professor Santiago has shown this in an article, processes in which concurrent control is present throughout an activity of recall or imagination. You say, I can remember my mother's face, and that can just come to me automatically, but I can also devise complex, detailed counterfactual scenarios in my head and just really go through them, and so I think that's another reason why remembering cannot just be assimilated to sneezing, because it is not that the automaticity is just present at the start and that it unfolds, but I think there are cases in which you can make the argument that it is present throughout, and that would be the only way I can envisage. There are perhaps other ways, but that's the way in which I can really envisage that you could make this argument that automaticity in arm racing and in memory are different. So that's what I would say.
Great, thank you. Beate?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for this very clear presentation. I have a question regarding this notion of a subpersonal level. I mean, it's a notoriously difficult term, or at least it's very difficult to actually say what is the subpersonal, what is personal level, and whether this isn't somehow a trick that you use this terminology, and maybe if you try to spell out what it actually means, then this will be what is the difference between an action and a non-action, or that there's this danger of becoming circular, that the subpersonal is whatever you cannot control, or whatever, or if it's not circular in that way and you find something that is the mark of the subpersonal and the personal, then this will be what is the difference between actions and non-actions, and control is maybe just not relevant, and automaticity.
Yeah, I hadn't considered that objection from circularity. I mean, yeah, so personal is a really difficult term, and I have not taken, I have not done work in order to define it. It's a very widespread term in psychology, and it's a widespread term in the discussion of mental actions, but no one really seems to say what it exactly amounts to. I think that you could call, subpersonal. I mean, the way in which I'm using the term and the way in which I think it is relevant for the discussion, it would mean something like that there's a number of levels of description in some given event of which the agent is not aware or has only very vague awareness. I think it's a more or less uncontroversial thing to say, for instance, about arm racings. So I think there's a number of physical processes, mechanisms which you may only be dimly aware of, and in that sense, well, I think this is not the standard usage in psychology, but I think it's the usage in which it would be relevant for comparing, physical and mental action. And I think you could say that the sense in which these processes are automatic in the case of mental action is much the same way. There are mechanisms which are not under the agent's direct awareness, and therefore they cannot be under his control, because lack of awareness in some sense, in some traditional sense at least, implies a lack of control. And so I think I think I would make it not circular, because I do recognize that there is some circularity in saying, well, actions are things you have control over, so personal mechanisms are things you don't have control over, and therefore they are not actions. But what I think I would say is that you can define subpersonality, at least in the sense relevant to this discussion. Again, this is not necessarily the most widespread usage, as lack of awareness, and then you could say that lack of awareness entails lack of control. And I think it is less controversial to distinguish things based on lack of awareness of the subject than by lack of control for the subject. But I am also not very sure about this, and I recognize that this second argument is more requires some more work, because I do think that I've relied on many things that are sort of intuitive to me but not clearly defined. But yeah, that's what I think I would say.
Great, thank you, Salvador. Thank you again. Very nice talk, very nice discussion. Before we go on, I just want to make an announcement, especially for Eric and Beate. Wait a minute. Laura, ¿podemos parar la grabación?